Good evening, gentlemen. Gibraltar has always interested me because in the 1990s, I had a couple of brief periods of duty there for the Royal Navy, and I found the place fascinating. I've since visited on a few occasions in cruise ships, most recently in January this year. I'll start my talk by recapping the geographical significance of the rock and the story of how it became and still is British. I will touch on its relations with Spain up until the end of the Second World War, and I will describe how it was evacuated, fortified, and briefly attacked. Let's start by reminding ourselves where Gibraltar is, and that should help anyone who is unconvinced why it was and still is important to Great Britain and NATO. This image taken from Google Earth shows the Western Mediterranean. This view looks northeast with the Alboran Sea of the Mediterranean on the right. You can see the rock standing as a sentinel over the strategic jewel of the strait. In antiquity, the rock and an unidentified peak in North Africa were known as the Pillars of Hercules. There is no peak that matches Gibraltar, so opinion is divided as to whether the southern pillar is Monte Hacho in Ceuta or Jebel Musa in Morocco. Finally, just to give you a feel for scale, here's a photograph of the modern-day strait looking south. This view by NASA shows the bay. I've added a red line to show the approximate border with Spain, yards north of the airport. Apart from Gibraltar, everything else shown is Spain. Let's zoom in closer. This is a CIA map dated 1989, 3 years before my first visit. I've chosen it because it's uncluttered. You can see the huge harbour with 3 dry docks in the south. Here they are. The largest is the Prince of Wales dock. Next is the long South Mole. In my 1992 photograph, you will see few commercial facilities. However, the northern half remains Ministry of Defence property and is able to service warships. In the foreground are the other remaining naval facilities, with the landing ship RFA Sebedovia unloading. It had just arrived for an exercise. In the centre is the detached mole. It protects the harbour from a westerly. It's used for ships not requiring loading or unloading facilities, as in the case of this tanker and bulk carrier. Here is Europa Point and its famous lighthouse, the only one outside the UK to be run by Trinity House. I took the picture on the left at sunrise. Finally, here is Rosier Bay, and it was to here on the 28th of October 1805 that the dismasted HMS Victory was towed after the Battle of Trafalgar. She was carrying the body of Nelson. The mole was built after 1805, so the facilities would have been quite primitive. Here's a Spaniard's eye view that I took in 1992. The cloud is an effect of an easterly wind known as a levanter. Moist, warm air hits the rock, is forced up and condenses. It can hang over the town for days, and it can occur at any time. It's most common between May and October. So, how does Gibraltar come to be British? In modern history, the first occupants were the Phoenicians from 950 BC. Later, the Carthaginians and the Romans established semi-permanent settlements. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, Gibraltar was briefly under the control of the Vandals. If you look at some of the modern buildings, it could be argued that it still is. Next, Gibraltar came under the Visigothic Kingdom of Hispania until the Moors took it in 711 AD. In the 1150s, Sultan Abd al-Mumin ordered construction of a fortification, creating a permanent settlement. Here is the Moorish castle from which the Union flag flies, where it can easily be seen from Spain. Next, Gibraltar became part of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada until 1309, when the Castilians invaded it. The occupation was brief because in 1333 the Marinids conquered it, who then ceded it to the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada in 1374. The first Duke of Medina Sidonia reconquered it in 1462, ending 750 years of Moorish control. Incidentally, there have been 22 dukes. It was, of course, the seventh who commanded the Spanish Armada. Although the Duke had been left in sole control, Gibraltar was claimed by King Henry IV of Castile, who added King of Gibraltar to his list of titles. Henry IV was a weak king, not helped by the unfortunate nickname of the Impotent. In 1468, following a variety of squabbles, Gibraltar was returned to the second Duke of Medina Sidonia. In 1474, in return for their defending it, he sold it to a group of Jewish conversos, those who had converted to Catholicism. They had it for 2 years, after which they were expelled during the Spanish Inquisition. In 1501, Gibraltar passed to the Spanish crown, which had been established in 1479. It was granted the coat of arms that it still uses today. The 80 Years' War was also known as the Dutch War of Independence. In 1607, there was a major battle when the Dutch surprised the Spanish fleet anchored in the Bay of Gibraltar. In 4 hours, the entire Spanish fleet was destroyed. Archduke Charles VI was the Austrian pretender to the Spanish crown. During the War of the Spanish Succession, English and Dutch troops, his allies, formed a joint fleet and attacked various towns on the southern coast of Spain. At 5 a.m. on the 4th of August 1704, the fleet of Admiral Sir George Rooke, aided by Field Marshal Prince George of Hesse-Darmstadt, bombarded the town for 6 hours. Our Royal Marines and 1,800 Dutch Marines captured the town of Gibraltar and claimed it in the name of Archduke Charles. Here's an illustration of the badge of the Royal Marines. I took this in Port Stanley, where it's on their memorial. There is much history in this badge. Suffice to say that it represents all their victories worldwide. After the battle, almost all the population felt that staying in Gibraltar was too dangerous and left for nearby areas of Spain. The town was nominally under Habsburg rule, with a British governor and a garrison that included both British and Dutch troops. Soon after its capture, French and Spanish troops laid siege to Gibraltar for 6 months, but failed to retake the rock. The siege was lifted on the 31st of March, 1705. The 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, which ended the war, awarded Britain sovereignty over Gibraltar. In Articles 10 and 11 of the treaty, Spain ceded Gibraltar and Minorca to the United Kingdom in perpetuity. Despite attempts by Spain to recapture it, Great Britain has retained sovereignty over Gibraltar ever since. However, Minorca has gone back to Spain in 1802. Unfortunately, the treaty failed to include a map defining exactly the area described. This gave both parties an opportunity to interpret the wording as it suited, giving much controversy in later years. Some of this area is known as British neutral ground. This was the area to the north of the city wall, militarily conquered and continuously occupied by the British, except during time of war. Spain separately disputes the sovereignty of this area, which today contains the airport, cemetery, a number of housing estates, and the sports centre. On the 11th of February 1727, Gibraltar suffered its 13th recorded siege, the second by Spain, and this lasted until the 12th of June. It was part of the Anglo-Spanish War. This is a contemporary Italian depiction. There were no more hostilities, and a truce was declared in February 1728, with the 1729 Treaty of Seville formally ending the war. Over the next few years, life for the people of Gibraltar was stable, despite bad relations between Britain and Spain. In 1748, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle ended the War of Austrian Succession. The 1763 Treaty of Paris ended the 7 Years' War and confirmed Britain's sovereignty. In 1779, this peace was shattered. The previous year, after learning of the American victory at Saratoga, France entered the American War of Independence on the side of the Americans. On the 12th of April 1779, France and Spain signed the Treaty of Aranjuez, whereby they agreed to aid one another in recovering lost territory from Britain. In June 1779, Spain allied itself with America. The Franco-Spanish alliance agreed that the first target was to be to seize Gibraltar. That would give them control of the Mediterranean as a precursor to an invasion of Great Britain. Within a month, what became known as the Great Siege of Gibraltar started. The garrison of 5,382 troops was blockaded at sea by the French. Also, the Spanish had about 13,000 ground troops constructing forts, redoubts, entrenchments, and batteries north of the rock from which to attack. The governor, General Elliot, commanding the defenders, formed a team of sharpshooters to pick off the besiegers. For the defenders, life was bleak as they suffered starvation, scurvy, and lack of fuel for fires to keep warm. On the 16th of January 1780, Admiral Rodney arrived to relieve the garrisons at Gibraltar and Minorca. He had a strong squadron escorting a convoy. On the 8th of January, he encountered a Spanish convoy of 17 merchant ships and 5 warships that he captured at Cape Finisterre. 8 days later, he sighted a squadron of 11 Spanish warships off Cape St. Vincent. The Spanish steered for Cadiz, but were chased and engaged. One blew up and Rodney took 6. This was said to be the first ever fleet action to be fought at night. Rodney's fleet brought reinforcements of 1,052 men and an abundance of supplies. Once he left, the siege remained as intense as ever. The British repulsed every Spanish attempt to take the rock by assault. Small ships ran the blockade to keep in touch with Minorca, but by late summer, things were getting bad again. It was not until the 12th of April 1781, that's 15 months later, that Gibraltar was relieved again, this time by Vice Admiral Derby. He brought 29 ships of the line, escorting 100 storeships. The Spanish fleet were unable to stop him, but they bombarded the town, causing considerable loss of life. Derby set sail for England on the 21st without hindrance from the Franco-Spanish fleet, taking Gibraltar's civilians with him. The Franco-Spanish forces just could not starve the British out, so they planned a huge all-out assault and assembled a large army and fleet to carry this out. The night before the attack was due, about half the garrison filed out of the defences and made a surprise attack, a preemptive strike. They spiked guns and routed the besieging infantry from their trenches. There was much destruction of Spanish equipment, totaling £2 million, a huge sum. That's about £337 million today. The Spanish lost over 200 casualties, but the British withdrew, denying the Spanish a chance to regroup and counterattack. This delayed the planned all-out attack for several months, but the siege remained as stringent as ever. Eventually, on the 13th of September 1782, the Franco-Spanish allies launched their great attack. It consisted of 5,190 fighting men aboard newly engineered floating batteries with 138 heavy guns. Also, there were 18 ships of the line, 40 Spanish gunboats and 20 bomb vessels. 86 land guns supported them. Over 80,000 spectators were said to have thronged to the adjacent hills over the Spanish border. Among them were the highest families in the land, assembled to see the fortress beaten to powder and the British flag trailed in the dust. After weeks of preparatory artillery fire, the floating batteries in the bay and the guns on land opened fire on the fortifications. The garrison replied with red-hot shot to set fire to and sink the attackers' floating batteries and warships. In that great conflict, the British destroyed 3 of the floating batteries, which blew up as the red-hot shot did its job. The Spanish scuttled the other 7. In addition, 719 men on board the ships were casualties, many of them drowned. There was much ingenuity shown by the defenders, and here's an example of a depressing gun carriage invented in 1782 by Lieutenant Curler, Royal Artillery. It's on display in Casemate Square. I photographed it in 1992, but it's now surrounded by a pavement cafe. Several caverns were hewn from bare rock at the north side. Here's a small selection of shots from my collection. The final shot shows the commanding view, although the scenery has changed rather in the succeeding 200 years. On the 11th of October 1782, Admiral Viscount Richard Howe arrived at Gibraltar with a fleet of 33 warships escorting a large convoy of stores. On the way, gales scattered a numerically superior Franco-Spanish force, so the convoy was able to unload. On his way home, Howe fought an indecisive battle before withdrawing to Britain in line with his orders. Finally, in February of 1783, the signing of peace preliminaries lifted the siege. General Elliot was nominated Knight of the Bath. In 1787, he was created first Baron Heathfield of Gibraltar. The Treaty of Versailles reaffirmed the previous treaties. After the siege, the defences continued to be increased. This print from 1810 shows rows of embrasures near the top end of the rock, the north end. This is one of my own, again from 1992. It was from now that construction of the lower level fortifications continued. They can be seen all over the town with gaps cut in for traffic. Many carry labels as shown here. This slide is indicative of the clutter that can be seen on the rock. Fortifications from the Moors, the Great Siege and the Second World War are visible in the same photograph. The Great Siege was the last battle for control of Gibraltar. Unbelievably, at various times up until then, Britain had seriously considered exchanging Gibraltar for some other Spanish possession. However, by now, Gibraltar's situation had achieved cult status, and such an exchange was politically unacceptable. In June 1803, Nelson arrived to take up the post of Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean, and the following year, typhus racked the rock. Almost 6,000 people perished by the end of the outbreak, over a third of the civilian population. At the outbreak of the Peninsular War in 1808, Britain and Spain became allies against France. Contingents from the Gibraltar garrison were sent to Cadiz and Tarifa to aid Spanish resistance to the French. In 1815, the civilian population was about 10,000. About a third were Genoese, having arrived early in the century. The rest were mainly Spanish and Portuguese, having fled from the Peninsular War. The town prospered and in 1830 became a crown colony. The responsibility changed from the War Office to the Colonial Office. In 1895, work started on the Admiralty Dockyard, in blue on this map. It was built partly on reclaimed land, and it took 10 years to complete this 440-acre site. In 1908, Britain fenced 1 metre inside what it considered to be the border with Spain. This was a practical decision to reduce the number of sentries. However, because the border was never mapped, this has still never been accepted by Spain, which claims that it was built on Spanish soil. In the Spanish Civil War, here is Salvador Dali's disturbing premonition. Great Britain was neutral. In 1938, Britain recognized Franco's nationalist regime and had Republican and nationalist consulates. 3 major incidents affected Gibraltar. On the 13th of May 1937, HMS Hunter, on a non-intervention patrol off Almeria, struck a mine laid by a nationalist E-boat a few weeks earlier. There were 12 casualties, including 8 killed. An Albert Medal and 2 Empire Gallantry Medals were awarded. After emergency repairs at Almeria, the cruiser HMS Arethusa towed her stern first to Gibraltar for repairs. There's a memorial to the dead in Gibraltar's Anglican Cathedral. A few weeks later, on the 29th of May 1937, the German Panzer Schiff Deutschland deployed to the Spanish coast in support of Franco's nationalists in a total of 7 operations between 1936 and 1939. During one of these deployments, Deutschland was attacked in Ibiza by 2 Republican bombers, and as a result, 31 German sailors were killed and 101 were wounded. This was direct retaliation for the Condor Legion's bombing of Guernica. The dead German sailors were first taken to Gibraltar and buried there. The wounded were taken to the Naval Hospital. However, Hitler ordered the bodies to be exhumed, and Deutschland carried them back to Germany for a large military funeral attended by Hitler. In retaliation, Deutschland's sister ship Admiral Scheer bombarded Almeria, killing 19 civilians and destroying 35 buildings. In this photograph, actually of Admiral Scheer at Gibraltar in 1936, you can see recognition stripes. British ships in the Med also carried these at the time, and here's a digitally coloured picture of Hood carrying similar stripes. In August 1938, the Republican destroyer Jose Luis Diaz took refuge in Gibraltar. She'd been trying to break the nationalist blockade of the Strait of Gibraltar. As a ruse, she flew the White Ensign and carried the pennant number of HMS Grenville, with which she had a strong resemblance. Strangely, I cannot find a photograph of Grenville with her HO3 pennant number. However, she was intercepted by the nationalist cruiser Canarius and other ships. After 2 frustrated attempts, she was forced into Gibraltar, where she underwent repairs while looking for an opportunity to try again. On the night of the 29th-30th of December, she left Gibraltar, prepared for a new attempt, but was spotted by the gunboat Calvo Sotelo. A close-range battle ensued between the destroyer and several rebel ships, including the gunboat minelayer Vulcano. Jose Luis Diaz was beached in Gibraltar to avoid being sunk or captured. The British returned the crew to the Republican side. When the Second World War started, work quickly got underway to build up Gibraltar's defences. The first major work was to build an airfield on the racecourse just to the north of the Rock and on land still disputed with Spain. The airfield, opened in 1939, was an emergency prepared strip for use by the Fleet Air Arm. Later, the runway was extended out to sea by reclaiming land. The first squadron ordered to Gibraltar on the 9th of September 1939 was 202, a flying boat squadron equipped with Saunders Roe London aircraft. Sunderland's replaced this obsolete type, and this is a Mark V from 201 squadron. Later, American-built Catalinas arrived. They operated from the harbour, and soon 200 Coastal Group was formed to coordinate all air operations from Gibraltar. It was subordinate to HQ RAF Mediterranean at Malta. The need to fortify the Rock and drastically increase the population of servicemen and women meant that the civilian population had to be evacuated. In late May, service families boarded the troop ships Devonshire and Empress of Australia to return to Britain. In early June 1940, all people not considered essential for the war effort, about 13,500 in all, were evacuated. Men of military age had been recruited into a local defence force, so they were excluded from the evacuation. With all the benefits of hindsight, the destination was odd: Casablanca in French Morocco. Within a few days, France capitulated, and Vichy France, with which Morocco was now aligned, was pro-Nazi. The Vichy government soon found the presence of the evacuees an embarrassment and looked for an early opportunity to rid itself of them. This moment came when a convoy of about 15 British cargo ships carrying 15,000 French servicemen evacuated from Dunkirk arrived at Casablanca. The ships were interned until agreement could be reached to remove the Gibraltarians. Matters were ugly because days earlier, Churchill had ordered the Royal Navy to attack the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir. There was no permission from the Admiralty, but Commodore Crichton, commanding the ships, opened up the gangways. The French herded the families aboard, sometimes at bayonet point, causing them to leave the bulk of their possessions behind. Back at Gibraltar, the governor refused permission for them to land. He was fearful that it would be impossible to evacuate them a second time. After public meetings and various negotiations, London gave permission for the refugees to land, and by mid-July, they were all back in Gibraltar. Eventually, after much negotiating with London about numbers, it was decided to send the bulk to London. By the end of 1940, about 10,000 were there, mainly in the Kensington area. Another 2,000 or so went to Madeira, and then on the 9th of October, 1,093 went directly from Gibraltar to Jamaica. More followed later. After the surrender of Italy in 1943, the way was open to return evacuees. In November, a resettlement board was established, and in February 1944, repatriation priorities were finally agreed. On the 6th of April, the first group of 1,367 arrived on the Rock directly from the United Kingdom. On the 28th of May, the first repatriation party left Madeira, and by the end of 1944, only 520 non-priority evacuees remained. In London, homecomers were making claims on the evacuees' accommodation, and 500 Gibraltarians were re-evacuated to Scotland and 3,000 to camps in Northern Ireland. The governor fought valiantly on their behalf for their return. As late as 1947, there were still 2,000 in Northern Irish camps. The last of the evacuees did not see the rock again until 1951. In addition to the airfield, work started to turn the rock into a huge fortress. This can easily be divided into two sections, tunnels and artillery. Let's look at tunnels first. Throughout the war, the most amazing set of tunnels was blasted out of the limestone rock. This was so that the entire garrison could live underground and resist a siege of up to a year. In addition to accommodation, the defenders required water, electric light, power, sanitation, a hospital, a laundry, ammunition, stores, etc. There were roads and passages, 30 miles. It is said that there are more miles of road inside the rock than outside. The later roads were 15 feet wide, with passing places every 100 yards. Not all the chambers were on the same level, hence the rather cluttered look of certain sections of this map. I've walked along the Admiralty Tunnel several times on my way to and from the operations room. It affords a view right through the rock, albeit a pinprick of light. I believe that the east end is now locked, but sailors used to be able to disembark from their ship, run through the tunnel, and be on the beach at Sandy Bay in a few minutes. Some of the accommodation was standard army buildings. Chambers were blasted with 2 feet of clearances all around for drainage and ventilation. It was vital for ventilation that there were no dead areas of air, or the chambers would have become damp and unusable. The solution was groups of chambers separated by pillars of solid rock, filled black on this slide, and with linking passages at the back. There were all sorts of arrangements. This is just one. For tunnels, there were standard sections created by standard blasting patterns. Initially, square or rectangular sections were used in chambers or tunnels up to 35 feet wide. However, rockfalls were experienced in some of the wider sections. Therefore, every chamber having a span of more than 12 feet was arched. One of the largest chambers, 380 feet long and 50 feet wide, was given an 11 feet rise of arch and was very successful. The Royal Engineers deployed 5 tunnelling companies. Many of the men were coal miners and soft rock miners. There were also 2 companies of Royal Canadian Engineers. They brought diamond-tipped drills, which speeded up drilling the larger chambers. The Royal Engineers also deployed an artisan work company, an army troops company, and a general construction company. In 1972, the Royal Engineers, with their links with the rock officially dating back to 1772, were awarded the freedom of Gibraltar. Undoubtedly, some of the veterans in the picture on the right did the tunnelling. For hundreds of years, the rock has had coastal defence artillery. Many of the weapons that I'm about to show you were installed at the turn of the century. The weapons can be divided into 4 principal types. The really heavy guns totaled 10 in 8 batteries at various points around the rock. 8 of the guns, as shown, were mounted in 6 single batteries and 1 twin. With a range of about 16 miles, far enough to reach the other side of the strait, and the accuracy of a stable gun platform, they would have provided a significant threat to ships trying to run the gauntlet. They were augmented by 1 twin howitzer battery with a range of about 7 miles. Fairly unsurprisingly, at least 3 of the guns right on top of the rock remain in place. In this shot, taken in 2010, Lord Airy's battery is on the left and O'Hara's battery is on the right. Here you can see both the anti-shrapnel protection added during the war and also the effect of the Levanter. The only other surviving battery that I'm aware of, Breakneck, can only be seen from the sea on the east of the rock. The main secondary gun, the 6-inch Mark 7, was deployed in 3 twin and 2 single batteries. Like the 9.2-inch Mark 10, this was a dual-purpose naval and coastal defence gun. There were also 5 quick-firing 4-inch guns, again designed for a dual purpose, naval and coastal defence role. The weapon illustrated is mounted on a ship, possibly a submarine. The left picture was taken from one of the galleries dug at the end of the Great Siege. The photograph was taken in 1992 and looks towards the marina area. I'm assuming that the guns are still there. You'll need good eyesight for the second photograph. They can be visited. This is my wife Georgie at the Devil's Gap Battery in 2015. However, they aren't an official tourist attraction. There was a mass of anti-aircraft defences, but the first anti-aircraft guns did not arrive until 1940. Until then, defence against air raids was in the hands of warships. These 2 stalwarts did the heavy work. The 3.7-inch came in both static and mobile versions, as here. There were 28 in 9 batteries of 2 or 4. There were only 4 of the 3-inch type in 2 pairs. Napier Battery was a fixed 4-gun 3.7-inch battery, and it's situated immediately north of Rosier Bay. You can see 1 anti-aircraft gun that's been reinstalled here. Incidentally, the battery was constructed around this huge Victorian muzzle-loading 100-ton supergun. It was commissioned in 1884, having been built by Armstrongs of Newcastle. The Italian Navy had commissioned 4 in 1870 to arm a battleship. The British, alarmed that the Italians could use them to bombard British bases, ordered 2, one for Malta and the other for Gibraltar. They can both be visited. Finally, there were 36 fixed single batteries of the ubiquitous Bofors anti-aircraft gun. There was also a formidable light anti-aircraft battery of 6-pounder twin guns on the moles. A variety of modern mobile weapons were moved to locations as considered appropriate. Let me finish this section with this night view of the searchlights at Gibraltar, ready for an air raid. The greatest modern threat to Britain's sovereignty of Gibraltar started in the middle of 1940. Having invaded Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries and part of France, Hitler was now deciding how to take the war to the British. Invasion of Britain was very much an option at the time. However, Reich Marshal Goering, head of the German Air Force, had other ideas. He advised Hitler to occupy Spain and North Africa rather than invade Britain. General Guderian took this idea forward. He just played a major part in the invasion of France. He advised Hitler to delay an armistice. Instead, he would rush through Spain with 2 panzer divisions to take Gibraltar and then invade North Africa. Note the Enigma machine in his truck. General Jodl took the lead in planning and produced a plan for Hitler. This was to invade Spain, Gibraltar, North Africa, and take the Suez Canal to cut Britain off from the east of her empire. Incidentally, at the end of the war, Jodl signed the surrender on behalf of Admiral Dönitz, now the Führer, following Hitler's suicide. Jodl was hanged following the Nuremberg trials. After Italy came into the war, Franco abandoned neutrality and declared Spain to be a pro-Axis, non-belligerent country. He offered port facilities to German naval ships and ordered the fortification of land immediately north of Gibraltar. That included 100 offensive artillery positions with capacity for 200 guns. In June 1940, Franco communicated verbally and very discreetly and offered to Hitler to attack Gibraltar on behalf of Germany. However, it would have required German support, particularly raw materials. Hitler's liaison with Franco was through Admiral Canaris, appointed in 1935 as head of the Abwehr, the German intelligence service. In July 1940, he was sent to Spain with his team. He met Franco in Madrid and then went to Algeciras to reconnoitre the approaches to Gibraltar. There were a variety of visits, and in view of what was later known about him, there are now doubts about exactly what influence he was exerting on Franco, the suggestion being that he was trying to dissuade Franco from cooperating. Canaris had been sickened by atrocities in Poland, and he undoubtedly became the single biggest opponent on Hitler's staff. He organised resistance to Hitler and was one of the leaders of the July 1944 assassination plot, for which he was jailed and executed in particularly ghastly circumstances. Franco's offer to take Gibraltar was not taken up. Instead, Girdle produced plans for an armoured thrust of 2 corps, say 50,000 men, through Spain, whose forces would need to stand aside. It was planned for January 1941, and he now gave the operation a name, Felix. There were logistical problems, not least that to move a force of this size quickly would normally involve trains. The Spanish rail system had been badly damaged during the Civil War. Also, trains in Spain and Portugal used a much broader gauge between the rails than France and the rest of Western Europe. It would therefore be necessary to transship at the border or jack up all the vehicles to change the bogies. Franco was cooling about the idea, and a meeting was arranged with Hitler in his headquarters train at Honda. By now, Germany had lost the Battle of Britain, and Hitler was looking for a more winnable target. He was looking for Franco's commitment to go to war and defeat the British. The negotiations went badly, with Franco procrastinating about his level of support. He didn't want to lose control of the situation by handing over the whole initiative to the Germans. Ultimately, both men signed a meaningless memorandum of understanding, neither getting what they wanted. Hitler is reported to have later told Mussolini, "I would rather have 4 teeth out than go through that again." Despite much further work by German planners, Hitler officially postponed Operation Felix on the 10th of January 1941. Also postponed at the same time was Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Operation Tracer was one of the best kept secrets of the war. In the event of Gibraltar being captured by German forces, 6 men would have been sealed into a secret chamber at Lord Airy's battery, high up on the southern ridge of the rock. They would have been expected to observe the activities of the Germans for a period of a year or more. Anyone who died within the chamber would have to be embalmed and cemented into the walls. The volunteers, 2 doctors, 3 signalmen, and an executive officer, would have had 2 vantage points, one looking due east over the Mediterranean and the other over the Strait and harbour. All shipping movements would be radioed to the Admiralty. By the end of 1941, construction work was underway on the chamber where the men would live. This would be 45 by 16 by 8 feet with a water tank containing 10,000 gallons of water and a passage section for the radio, toilets, and observation points. Much thought was given to the radio installation, which would be run from batteries, which would be powered by a generator charged by a bicycle. Colonel Gambier Parry, head of the Secret Intelligence Service Communications, gave advice. An aerial 18 feet long was to be pushed out of an opening when required. By mid-1942, the operation was ready. It was not until August 1943, with the pressure on the new Eastern Front and the redeployment of the German forces, that it was decided to put Operation Tracer on ice. The 6 volunteers were stood down, the stores and equipment removed, and the chamber blocked up. Notwithstanding its defences, Gibraltar was attacked at various times. The first came on the 18th of July 1940 from Vichy French aircraft after the Royal Navy had attacked the French fleet at Mers el Kabir. The attack by pilots reluctant to harm their former ally was half-hearted, and most bombs fell in the sea. There were further Vichy attacks on the 24th and 25th of September. In the first raid, 150 bombs were dropped, with twice as many from over 100 aircraft in the second. In the first raid, the South Mole and a large ship in the harbour were damaged. The following day, anti-aircraft fire shot down one Leo 451 bomber, and the British armed trawler Stella Sirius was sunk. In 1942, the Italian Air Force launched attacks from Sardinia. There were 4 small raids involving up to 5 aircraft. The Italians took 33% losses. The British lost 1 Lockheed Hudson, destroyed on the ground, and some artillery pieces, all in the first mission. Whatever their success in the air, the Italian Navy had some very brave and skilled submariners and divers attacking Gibraltar. A scourge of the British in the Mediterranean was an Italian Commando Frogman unit, the 10th Assault Vehicle Flotilla. They launched many raids, but I will mainly confine this to Gibraltar. They used chariots, the so-called human torpedoes. Ridden by 2 frogmen, these weapons were designed to attack ships at anchor. Upon reaching their target, the warhead would be detached and laid under the target. The frogmen would then retire and await developments. This illustration of dry practice on a small railway wagon highlights just how dangerous these operations will have been. The chariots were carried to the forward base for launch in converted submarines. The first, Irede, left La Spezia for Alexandria in August, but it was spotted off Tobruk and sunk by swordfish aircraft. Also converted was this Adua-class submarine, Seige. The deck gun was removed, and 3 cylinders, 1 forward and 2 aft, were attached to the casing to carry the chariots. On the 24th of September 1940, the submarine left La Spezia carrying 3 chariots. The attack was called off and the submarine ordered to La Maddalena. The target, Force H, had left Gibraltar before Seige could get into position. A month later, Seige left La Spezia and sailed to Gibraltar carrying 3 manned torpedoes. On the 30th of October, the chariots entered the harbour but damaged no ships. 2 of the crewmen were captured and the others escaped to Spain, eventually returning to Italy. A chariot later washed ashore in Spigen Bay and was interned by the Spanish. On the 25th of May 1941, Seige left La Spezia carrying 3 chariots. At Cadiz, it secretly loaded 6 crewmen. They found no warships in Gibraltar. Force H, HMS Renown, Ark Royal and Sheffield, had been ordered into the Atlantic as part of the search for the Bismarck, which was sunk on the 27th. Success at Gibraltar came in September 1941. Again, the submarine went via Cadiz, and this time the charioteers sank 3 ships, 2 tankers and a cargo ship. After placing their charges, the crew swam to Spanish territory and later returned to Italy. During its short career, Seige undertook many missions in the Mediterranean, her most successful being in December 1941 at Alexandria. There, her chariots severely damaged the battleships Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. On the 10th of August 1942, the armed trawler Islay sank Seige off Haifa. Despite that, Chariot and swimmer attacks on Gibraltar continued. The Italians used an interned cargo ship, Altera, as a base. It was at Algeciras on the opposite side of Gibraltar Bay. Here is a hidden hatch. Between July 1942 and the Italian surrender in October 1943, there were 4 attacks on Gibraltar, 3 of which were successful, and 10 British merchant ships were sunk. Let me finish this talk with a mention of 2 major international figures who, for different reasons, feature in the story of Gibraltar. The first is an American, the then Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower. In July 1942, he was appointed Allied Commander-in-Chief of Operation Torch. Churchill placed Gibraltar under his command as the temporary headquarters for this, the first large-scale Anglo-American operation of the war. Eisenhower arrived in Gibraltar on the 5th of November 1942 to take over, not just command of Operation Torch itself, but also military command of Gibraltar. He lived at the convent, the governor's residence, but had a modest office inside the rock. I know the room. I've worked in it. Very briefly, the first Anglo-American landings of the war involved mainly American troops supported in the Atlantic by the US Navy and in the Mediterranean by the Royal Navy under Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham. In 1943, Eisenhower became Supreme Commander of the North African Theatre of Operations. General Sikorski, who had been Prime Minister of Poland for 6 months in 1922 and 23, had escaped to France after the Nazi invasion of the 1st of September 1939. He'd set up the Polish government in exile in Paris on the 30th of September. The government moved to London after the fall of France in 1940. Despite Poland's defeat at the hands of the Germans, the exiled government had significant political influence, not least for the size of the forces that it had managed to escape. Polish units fought heroically in many European theatres. It was Poles who finally took Monte Cassino, and in 1943, Sikorski went to North Africa to visit Polish units there. On the 4th of July 1943, on his way home, his Liberator II, an RAF-operated unarmed transport variant of the famous American bomber, called at Gibraltar. 16 seconds after taking off, it crashed into the sea, killing all but the pilot. There were many conspiracy theories, and the Royal Air Force inquiry was inconclusive, suggesting poor maintenance leading to jamming of the controls. General Sikorski was subsequently buried in the Polish cemetery at Newark-on-Trent. In 1993, his remains were transferred to the Royal Crypts at Krakow. The only examination was merely to confirm his identity. In 2008, his remains were exhumed for a full examination. A report published in 2009 concluded that there was no evidence that he'd been murdered. However, I understand that some people still harbour suspicions and that the controversy continues. So, ladies and gentlemen, Gibraltar is a fascinating place with history everywhere one looks. It's changing fast, with much development on reclaimed land. In 1997, my cabin in what by then had become Gibraltar Officers' Mess, no longer HMS Rook, had a view across Coaling Island and the harbour to Morocco. After that, I was there. Flats obscured the view. The site has now been raised, I assume, for more flats. Thank you.